Welcome back to the Evolution Partners podcast. This is episode 2 in our special 7-part series exploring the ideas behind our new book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better. In episode 1 last week, we introduced the core premise that owner-led companies often chase bigger businesses, believing that it will bring freedom, wealth, or fulfillment. But as we discussed, without clear accountability or structure, freedom can become a trap. Owners fall into reactive leadership and the business starts to feel heavier and doesn't feel any better. Today we turn to chapter 2, which is the pressure for bigger. This is where we explore what actually drives that relentless pursuit, why so many smart, motivated leaders find themselves chasing revenue, headcount, or surface-level milestones without stopping to ask, is this even the game that I want to win? We'll talk about 3 key forces that create this pressure: your own psychology, your DNA, and the world around you. Then we'll dive into one of the most important ideas in the book, drift, and how it slowly erodes your team, your customers, your offering, and your profitability. And finally, we'll finish by talking about what it looks like to start building a better business and a better life. Richard and Andreas, good to have you both back today.
Thanks, Brad. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Thanks for having us again.
Indeed. Excited to jump in and talk about the pressure for bigger. Why do we end up becoming impulsive risk takers? So let's jump in, shall we?
Yeah, no, I was excited to get into this conversation because I think this frames a lot of what comes later in the book, this pressure. So you open the chapter by saying we live in this world of effort, and that really struck me. So why does the concept of effort matter so much when we're talking about the chase for bigger?
Well, there are different types of people in the world. I think that everyone can agree on that at least. And some people will put in more effort in any area than others. If we were to talk about a sporting pursuit or a business pursuit or an artistic pursuit or a learning pursuit or just going out to party, some people are going to put in more effort in one area than others. And every human pursuit and success really is born of effort. So we live in this world of effort, and different types of people have different perspectives when it comes to effort. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I was thinking you were going to say something a little bit further there, but that's fine. I appreciated the answer. Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, when you asked that question, Richard, a couple of my conversations with my clients came up because that's what they learn. And when we're having initial conversations and they start saying, well, I just want to double, I want to 10x, or I want to get bigger, because bigger, for lack of a better word, bigger is better for them initially, because that's what they've learned. And it's interesting how that there are all these examples coming up. And so it's going to be great to discuss a bit further on what actually takes them to that point.
I think that it's important to note that the title of the book is intentionally written to challenge one's thinking that bigger isn't better, better is better. Like, it's very intentional because people who are enamored with bigger are living, and let's be fair, to a degree we all are living in this world where bigger is better, thinking to themselves, well, that's simply not true. You've got to get to scale. You've got to get enormous. But what we're really saying here is that it's not about the size, it's about the quality of the business and the life that you lead. And that doesn't mean that your business shouldn't be growing. And one of the great examples that I've got in the book is where one of the teams that we work embraced this mindset, and this is a book about mindset, and they compounded a better team, better customers, better offering, better financials, and then better life by design. But what was happening is that their business actually ended up growing faster than their industry. And so it's simply about saying there is this pressure for bigger in the world that makes us act in a certain way. And especially if we have these propensities from society, from our DNA, from our psychology that make us irresponsible risk takers. irresponsive, impulsive risk takers, I'll get these words right one day, makes us act in that way. And so when we can transition to be strategic executors, it really, really can work to compound. So this is a book about the mindset of compounding.
I guess the idea of mindset, it comes to life in a couple of different ways in this chapter, but one of them is the mindset of winning. So, unlike in sort of sports or academia, business, there is no real clear scorecard. So I guess it poses the question, so what happens when leaders don't have a defined way to win? Is that the thing that is causing this problem, Brad?
Well, that's one of the things, okay? And so one of the things that makes me quite uncomfortable is when people say that business is exactly like sport. Now, I think that teams are very much like sport, the way that humans come together and humans interact and humans can be motivated in a certain direction. But when we zoom out and we look at business as a whole, in sports, there's a scoreboard and there's an opposition, and we know what the rules are. We know when the game begins and when it's halftime and when it ends. We know all of the ways that the sport operates, unlike a business. Because in the business world, when you're operating a business, I mean, you need to have legal compliance, you need to have ethical compliance and so forth. But beyond that, there are no rules. And that's why great strategies are born by breaking the rules. There are no rules. The competition does what they want, really, and we can do what we want. There's no real definition of what winning means, and there's no end point. So it's not like we're going to get to the end of the financial year and then we're going to succeed. So for all of these reasons, it's very, very different to sports. And when we use this at the mindset of a sports team, and to apply it in the broader context of business, it can be quite challenging. So we've got to think about, what does it mean to win in business? Because to win in sports, we score more points than the opposition. But to win in business, well, it depends on what your definition of winning is. Because if your definition of business is to become bigger at the expense of everything else, then you've got to really think about, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's that temptation that something bigger, 100 million, 200 million, is a score, but it's just a measurement. It's just a thing, right? And I think that's the challenge is that there's often this temptation that we can correlate size with winning rather than being better at something than anybody else on the planet. It's a different type of winning, but it's not measured in, 100 million or 200 million. That's just measured in being absolutely the best at something, right?
And I'm
Yeah.
sure our listeners are probably thinking, "Well, but I already know what winning is for me. Maybe it's a bit of profit, or maybe it's a bit of more deals." And if we actually step back, a lot of these goals about winning, it could be perhaps considered as an expense in the P&L. When we bring it back to what you mentioned, Richard and Brad, about revenue, 200 mil or whatever it is, it could be considered, as you mentioned, Brad, in the book, that's the real expense. So if we were to unpack this a little bit more, what would it mean for those leaders, business owners who are thinking, I already have my winning definition. It's either profit or revenue or more deals or a bit of that. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times I've asked an entrepreneur, what does success mean? How would you define success? And they've come back with something like, we would, in a trades business, for example, we would have 50 vehicles. Or for someone else, they might say, well, we have an office in each state of the country, or we have a North American and a London office, something like that. It is important to note that all of those things are expenses on the profit and loss. So if you're defining success as an expense, you've really got to ask yourself, well, why don't we do that today? Because we can open an office in multiple countries or states, or we can go out and buy a fleet of vehicles today. But that is the mindset of the person who thinks that bigger is better. Because when I get to have 15 offices, I will be a success. And then my neighbors will respect me, and the people I don't like will be forced to respect me, and it's all simply not true. It's much better to think, well, success would mean if we achieved this profit, or if I was able to take this many days off per year, or if we stopped burning out our people, or if I actually wanted to come to work. Last week, I walked into a meeting with an owner of a $50 million business, and he was absolutely upset and said, I want to quit. They were his words. So surely a better business is one that you don't want to quit and you actually can fall in love with your business.
No, I totally agree. It reminds me, I met somebody last week who I asked them that question, what was their ambition for the business? And they immediately went to numbers, which is exactly what we've been talking about. And I said, so if you got there, would that give you the type of life that you're looking for? And there was this horrible pause. And then, no. I said, so what would be that better outcome for your business? So size is good because it helps fund things that are important, growth and people and employees and product development and further investment. But those are all amazing things to have. But what do you want to do with this once you get there? And that person came back and said, well, I actually want to change the dialogue around this product application to health. And I won't go into the exact details of that because it was quite unique, but it was just completely redefining what better was going to look like. And that became probably the substance of next 45 minutes of conversation, because that was the most interesting thing about building a better business, not just a bigger business in 3 years.
Yeah.
And I
What's the point of hitting $200 million in revenue if you're miserable, or if you get divorced and you have to divide your balance sheet in two and your kids don't like you, or whatever is the thing? Like, there's a very good reason why chapter 7 is about building a better life by design. Andreas, what were we going to say?
listening to our clients and the stories that you're mentioning, there's probably a reason, there's a pattern, perhaps, that these impulsive risk takers are inclined to answer in that way. Not for no reason, when we ask the first question, what is winning to you, or what success looks like to you, they start with numbers. So I wonder, what is that pattern? What is that motivation, perhaps, that brings these impulsive risk takers maybe to answering that way?
I think we've got to start by asking the question about the first thing we spoke about, which is effort. So what is people's likelihood to sacrifice in order to succeed? Now, there's a bell curve diagram in the book, and it really breaks it up into about 5 different areas across this bell curve. And at the far left, there are people who are not willing to sacrifice anything to succeed. They want life handed to them on a plate, and they want you to bring the plate to them. These people are not going to succeed because they don't want to they don't want to sacrifice anything. Next is those who are willing to make a small sacrifice to succeed. And then the bell curve kind of indicates that the vast majority of people in the population are willing to sacrifice something to achieve, to succeed, to achieve something that they will be able to succeed in. Then, as we keep moving to the right of the bell curve, there are those who will sacrifice almost anything to achieve. And so they're working hard, working late, they're doing quite a lot. And then finally, on the very far right, there is the very small percentage who will sacrifice anything to achieve. These are the people who are probably more famous or more rich, and equally have sacrificed an incredible amount of their life in order to achieve that. None of them are right and none of them are wrong. It's just a pattern that emerges. And I'm probably thinking that as I'm saying that, you're thinking about people who may have fallen into each of those areas. And in fact, each of us have probably fallen into different areas through different parts of our life. It's important to think about this. What are you willing to sacrifice to achieve? Because if you're running the wrong race and you get to the finish line of that race chasing bigger instead of better, and you are the kind of person that has got the psychology or the DNA or is influenced, you're suffering from this pressure to be bigger, and you're sacrificing anything to achieve, sacrificing so many important parts of your life, what happens when you get to the end of that race and find out that you've actually been on the wrong track?
I remember a conversation where the person was telling me, well, look, this is what the effort that it will take to me to get the company where they wanted to go. And I'm ready for anything. And we went through a couple of things. Well, what about your family, or what about your personal time? Let's say like that. What about this? And the person was very, very driven. He was an impulsive risk taker, willing to put a lot of effort into achieve what he wanted to achieve. And then he was the one starting to question himself through the conversation, and hearing himself, he was saying, is something wrong with me? That I'm driven to actually take all these risks and the effort that it takes. And it was a real breakthrough moment for this person to get obviously a bit more clarity on what actually is or could be driving those behaviors. To that question, is it something wrong with me? No, not really. But I'm sure we're going to unpack what might be happening to those impulsive risk takers, willing to put in the effort to sacrifice. And is that a bad thing? Is that something that it might be driven by something else, perhaps? Richard?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, you could have left chapter 1 thinking about impulsive risk takers as a negative, but I think we're actually starting to reframe impulsive risk takers on a journey, right? And it's we're getting into this mindset and this topic of motivation, right? The motivation to succeed is different, right? And I think that's a really positive way to start thinking about it. Like, that's where people are now about to put in the effort, the sacrifice, because they're motivated to succeed. And I think that's what makes owner-led businesses, founder-led businesses different. They have a different reason for motivation. Would you agree with that, Fred?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Different reason. What we're saying in the book is that it is coming down to these 3 areas. So people who we're calling impulsive risk takers have low discipline and low patience. Now, why? Our job is to take the people, the owner-led companies, the impulsive risk taker, and turn them into a strategic executor. The traditional entrepreneur thinks, I'm the idea, for want of a better term, I'm the genius who keeps coming up with all of these ideas to make this business better. And all I need is a team who can go and execute that, because those ideas are fantastic. But that's born of this patience and discipline. And then why do we get into that situation? I believe that anyone can become a strategic executor with the right system and framework and perspective. Why do we get into that situation? Well, it's the pressure for bigger, which is what we're talking about today. So digging into it, let's start with psychology. So first of all, I'm drawing on work by Dave McClelland and his thematic apperception test, which is a psychological phenomenon. Generally, people fall into 3 needs, which is the need for achievement, the need for affiliation, and the need for power. Logically, how do we get into this state? Well, it could be as simple as when you were in primary school, a teacher said that you're not going to be successful, and you said, "Oh, well, stuff you, I'm going to be successful." Or it could be the way that your parents treated you when there was jobs to be done around the house. It could be any kind of thing, but the framings that occur psychologically, which is the nurture component of psychology rather than nature, the framings that happen as we're growing up, they begin to put us into broadly one of these 3 areas: achievement, affiliation, or power. So affiliation, to start with that, these are people who have a great need to be in friendships and chatting all the time and always having conversations with a lot of people. The next is the need for power. And the claim that I make in the book is that a person who enjoys working in a corporation where they can accumulate power, a corporation or a government, wherever it might be, any situation where these are the kind of people that love that environment because they've got that need for power. The third one is need for achievement. And these are the people who, going back to that bell curve, will do anything or almost anything in order to achieve success. So success and power are 2 very different things in this psychology take. And thinking about the impulsive risk taker from psychology, if you have this need for achievement, no matter what, I need to achieve things, it will drive you and drive you and drive you. You have that motivation. Now, Patience is a push thing. Discipline is a push thing. Like, you've got to push to get patience. You've got to push to get discipline. If you don't have motivation is, sorry, I'd said that backwards. Discipline and patience are pull things, whereas motivation is a push thing. Motivation pushes you consistently to achieve, and that comes psychologically from this perspective, from need for achievement.
So could we say psychology is one part of all of this? But I wonder about another theme you explore in the book, which is this concept of entrepreneurship being in the DNA of you as an individual. Do you want to expand on that? Because I think that it complements the conversation you've just had about psychology and your motivations.
Yeah, there's an argument we're all familiar with, which I just touched on before. Is it nature or nurture? Are people like that because of their DNA, or are people like that because of the way they were brought up? And that kind of goes back to this thing called the blank slate theory on one front, but without digging into that. I think that there's sufficient body of evidence that I allude to in the book, or that I quote in the book, from world-class DNA experts, that there is a propensity for people to be more like their parents in certain areres. Now, an example, if your parents are experts at maths, there is a very good chance that you could be good at maths, just as an example. Now, this has been demonstrated through twin experiments, where twins were put up for adoption and they went different ways. And then they were able to later track these people down through various studies and find out that, yes, in a completely different environment, these people tend to have similar traits. And so when we come back to entrepreneurship, my own story is that I was adopted and I didn't meet my birth mother until I was 24. And by the time I was 24, I'd already started 2 businesses. Now, the context for that is that when I grew up, my adopted parents were public servants. I'd never even met anyone who was a supervisor or manager, let alone an entrepreneur. So for me to have started 2 businesses by the time I was 24 was incredibly crazy to them. They were like, this doesn't make any sense at all. Why would you do that? And then when I met my birth mother when I was about 24, I connected with and began to understood my heritage, and came to learn that, in fact, she was an entrepreneur, and then her dad was an entrepreneur, and then his dad was an entrepreneur, and so forth and so forth. So it was, anecdotally, in my experience, it was true as well. The second part is, I had Paloma Hatami from My Gene in Melbourne on this podcast, and Paloma described there is definitely genes and traits in her work that relate to entrepreneurs, and the studies that she's done around that. So for some people, they are more likely to have entrepreneurial traits and more likely to have traits relative to risk taking. And so when we combine those traits with the need to achieve from psychology, we begin to put together this recipe, this mix that can generate an impulsive risk taker.
You mentioned at the beginning there were 3 elements that actually motivate. And I'm sure the audience is probably thinking, don't leave us hanging. What's the third one? You mentioned psychology. You mentioned the DNA. What is that third element that might motivate these impulsive risk takers?
Well, it's the world around you. It's the bigger is everywhere. It's such a controversial book title because it doesn't make sense, because everyone everywhere is talking about bigger. Newspapers and media talk about bigger endlessly. There is no shortage of media articles that are writing about bigger and bigger successes. Countries are measured predominantly on their gross domestic product, which is the total sum of all monies generated within a period, which is a bigger measure. And there are so many, if you open up any media outlet, any page, it's going to talk about something that is getting bigger, some bigger environment. But also, they're also predominantly the media talking about corporations and why if all you ever see is stories about corporations rather than businesses that are of your size, you will think that there is a pressure there and that this is what I need to work toward.
So one could argue that if you can simply control for your worst impulses, you are aware of your DNA, and you resist reading too many books about large corporations, you'll be fine.
One could.
But I think there's a bridge though there, because those are things I think that help us understand motivation, understand willingness to sacrifice, help us understand the mindset of folks who are entrepreneurs. But surely there has to be other things we need to take into account in order to be able to focus our energy to build a better business versus just a bigger business. Can you speak to that?
I think, first of all, when we say worst impulses, I think that it's important to understand what we spoke about. Entrepreneurs can do anything, but they can't do everything. And when we talk about these three forces coming together, psychology, DNA, and the pressure for bigger, or the pressure from the outside world, all of the greatest achievements in human history have been as a result of these things. So yes, it leads to someone being an impulsive risk taker and chasing bigger that they don't really want. But equally and inversely, this is where your superpower lies. And so we've got to focus and channel that toward better. And then I forgot your question, Richard.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that as we start to think about responding to these insights, how do we turn those into a powerful mix, a powerful sort of opportunity set that allows us to build that better business, that better life? I worry that it could be seen as too simplistic, because I think as these things are happening, the reason why we're talking about impulsive risk takers and the journey to a strategic executor is that there are things that start to happen to their businesses that they need to be aware of, that are some of the clues that they haven't perhaps harnessed or responded to some of these powerful forces like psychology, DNA, and the drive for bigger. Do you want to talk about that? You bring this concept of drift into the book later in this chapter, and I think it starts to frame how we see the symptoms of a business that is being driven by this bigger mentality versus this better mentality.
Yeah, so in a living organism, there's a thing called homeostasis. Homeostasis is the function of the body that maintains an equilibrium. Okay, so it makes sure that your temperature's right. It makes sure that all of the different components of the body work in this regulated state. But there is no homeostasis in a business. There is never a constant and steady state that the business works to maintain. So if we accept that as being true, there is no homeostasis function in a business, then we say, well, what happens if a business stays the same? What happens if, let's say, you are at $10 million revenue and you stay at $10 million revenue precisely? Well, with nothing changing at all, if you are like, let's keep everything absolutely, completely, precisely the same, well, what begins to happen is a business can start to drift. And so drift is the thing that is, I guess it's born of erosion. There's a word around erosion where entropy, that's it. It's born of entropy to a degree, but businesses begin to drift. So think about a boat on the ocean without sails, without a motor, that's not tied onto anything. It goes where the wind and the tides take it. And so businesses drift when it comes to financials. So first of all, businesses will no, I said that wrong. Teams drift towards toxicity. I'll get it right soon. Hopefully by the end of this 7-part series, I'll remember what this book is about and I'll remember some of the words that are in it. So first of all, teams drift towards toxicity. Okay. So you get a group of people together, and what happens is over time, it starts really, really nice, but then unless you are actively working on the team and they're in a, let's say, a steady state, someone says something to someone else that they find a bit confusing, and someone else tells someone else about it, and then it gets a bit. So we see this if you ever look at reality TV. In reality TV, the producers intentionally put personality types together that will clash and are very, let's say, forthcoming, and they film it to get paid by advertisers for ratings, right? But teams will naturally drift.
So then I guess one of the things that we have to be looking for is, as we see this toxicity, this drifting, this malaise that starts to set in, we need to see that as a symptom of action needing to be taken to sort of improve the health of the business. Would that concept be true in the concept of customers as well? What would cause that shift? And how do you see that coming to life in businesses that are drifting from a customer perspective?
So indifference, customers drift toward indifference. And what I mean by that is when we win a new customer, the day that we win the deal can be different than a year later or 3 years later in some sense. So entrepreneurs can sometimes be more excited about the day we win the customer compared to the 100th day we serve that customer. And equally, that's from our perspective, but equally, customers can become a little bit like, well, it's just a part of my life and I'm not really that excited about you. So you think about the first time you engaged someone to do something, you needed to build the trust, but then that trust sat there for a while and began to drift towards indifference. I'm not really that fussed about it.
It's almost like that concept of a tax on loyalty or a loyalty tax, right, that we often hear talked about, which is, this idea that you're paying sort of the same amount of money for a slowly but surely eroding level of service or value because you're not treated the same as that sexy new customer that's just walked in the door, right? I think that's the other side from a customer perspective. Andreas, over to you.
And probably that's one of the main reasons that in the work that we do, every quarter when we do our planning with clients, we actually go back to the cohesion of the team to make sure that we're on top of that, because naturally they will drift towards that toxicity, as you described, Brad. And equally important is to go around the different elements of the drift to stay on top, right? Like what's really going on with our customers. And one of the questions that we ask them all the time is, what are the recurring things? Could be issues, bad or good things that we hear from our customers. Because that pattern that we've been talking about, that pattern actually will probably tell the business owner, impulsive risk taker, and their leadership team, well, oops, maybe this is where we can see, unintentionally, of course, but this is where we can see that loyalty fade in terms of customers. And of course, so we spoke about the teams that drift towards toxicity and the customers that drift towards indifference. And Brad, in the book, you also mention the offerings that actually drift towards mediocrity. So how does doing more, perhaps, how does that mindset of more could slide into this mediocrity of offerings? How do we actually define, perhaps, business owner, identify, how do I see that going? How do I identify when it starts to drift towards that mediocrity?
So there is these 4 areas of drift that we're talking about. Teams drift towards toxicity, customers drift toward indifference, and now we're talking about offerings drift toward mediocrity. And so there's a couple of ways. It is the way that is interpreted by the customer, but if we try to add more offerings, so if we're trying to get bigger by adding more, we can only be competent at that. And this is coming back to what can we be the best in the world at? What can we truly, genuinely, bona fide be the best in the world at? And one of the examples I give in the book is if you're a computer reseller, for example, and you service and sell computers, and then you say, well, look, we should get into printers because people who use computers, they print things. Okay, that's logical, fair enough. And then because we get into printers, well, maybe we should get into mobile phones because people who use computers also have mobile phones. And every time you're adding these new offerings, you can be competent at them perhaps, but you can't be the best at them. And so what we're doing is we're saying really have a consideration about, are you drifting toward, is your offering drifting toward mediocrity by adding more and more and more in the pursuit of bigger? And a lot of people either start satellite businesses or they start other areas of offerings that they just can't be the best at. And so inversely, in this chapter, because this frames out the next 4 chapters of the book, this drift, what we're saying is, well, what are the 100 little things that you can do to make your offering so much better that you can improve the customer experience, that you can improve the team's experience and build better financials?
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. This 100 better things. We've had few examples of that, in the talks and chats we've had and time together. But it reminds me of a conversation last week where a client had been adding more and more offerings. And we had instituted some real discipline about looking at each of these new product segments or revenue segments. And they were doing so much more. Business had gone up by 60% year on year. It was a fantastic story. There was lots more cash washing through the system. But we looked at some of the offerings that had been added, and they were actually below break even.
Yep.
And there was this really sort of powerful moment when it became clear that we'd added these because we thought it was just a good idea. We were the reseller of the next thing. And in fact, they took an incredibly courageous decision to pull that back to just 2 versus 4. And in doing that, everybody in the business suddenly went, thank goodness, because this drive to sort of add more and more offerings, they were becoming me too, mediocrity. I use the phrase incremental mediocrity with every new offering.
Yeah.
And so, it's important because I think you put these things together, customers, teams, and offerings, and then we see the resultant effect, right? Which is this sort of drift towards unprofitability, and we don't often see it. What from your perspective, and for the folks who are listening along here, what are the most common behaviors that quietly sort of drive this erosion of margin? Because revenues, for the bigger crew, but if we're trying to build a better business with, margin being the real top line, what are the things that start to show up in that erosion?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of ways to think about the financials drifting towards unprofitability. So there's a particular graph in the book where there are 3 lines. The first line is sales or total income, and that's going up at let's say a 45-ish degree. Then there's gross profit dollars, which is not increasing at the same amount, but it's going up a little bit. And then there's net margin percentage, which is going down. And I'm not specific about the amount, but this is the signature from one lens of financials drifting towards unprofitability. The more that you grow, the less profit margin percent that you make. And it's born of, in one sense, chasing bigger over better. If I just get to 100 million, all of my problems will be solved, one might think to themselves. But what's happening is they're having teams where they are drifting towards toxicity. They have customers who are becoming a bit indifferent. They've got offerings that are drifting towards mediocrity, and they're wondering why they can't command an applause. And as Bo Burlingham said on this podcast, profit is the applause of customers. And so from one lens, what we're saying is that is often what we see to be the natural output of chasing bigger as a mindset rather than better. Whereas if you're compounding better, what you can do is you can still grow, but you can grow while maintaining margins and building the life that you want. But the second component is about simply inflation. If a business financially aims for homeostasis, if it's trying to find this steady state in the mindset of the owner, what's happening is the wages are going up, the rent's going up, electricity, the cost of goods is going up all the time. And we've spoken with Herman Simon, the world-leading price expert, on how to set pricing and why that's so important. And so we want to know that financials drift towards unprofitability, and so we need to work against that for the aforementioned reasons.
So if we put together DNA, psychology, and the societal drive, and we see these symptoms of drift because of the pursuit of bigger as a consequence, is there a danger that owners, founders could be actually accelerating this, almost like throwing sort of petrol on the fire?
Funny you should mention that. And that's the thing, right? So in a natural, normal, standard, regular business, drift is occurring. Teams are drifting towards toxicity. Customers are drifting towards indifference. Offerings are drifting towards mediocrity, and financials are drifting towards unprofitability. This is the standard state. And this is why we must work on the business. You've heard of the phrase working in the business and on the business. This is why we must work on the business. But then when we back that up with those 3 areas, the psychology, the DNA, and the society, that's forcing or pushing us to be bigger. We want, as we are undisciplined and impatient, impulsive risk takers, we are pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing bigger. And like you said, it's like putting petrol on the fire. So what happens is that teams drift towards toxicity much, 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 much faster. Why? Because we make impulsive risk taker decisions that make that happen quicker. And then customers drift towards indifference because we're trying so hard to grow so fast because we're impulsive and we're making often these kind of decisions that can lead to real challenge. Next, and so we're putting petrol on that fire. And then, with still quite a bit of petrol floating around, we're going to the offerings and we're looking for any mediocre offerings that we can put out into the marketplace. So we're, as impulsive risk takers, we're going out and we're amplifying that. And then finally, the unprofitability without a deep understanding of the working capital requirements of the business and how to stay ahead of that. And with the aforementioned focus on getting bigger, we're also doing that. So yeah, absolutely. That is the sense that we are focused. We're putting petrol on the fire that's already there, which is drift.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me, I was having a conversation last week with a client who was talking about renewal rates, and they were trying to predict renewal. And there was all these mathematical calculations, and the conversation took a great turn when I said, so what is the difference between a good and bad renewal? So they're not all equal, right? That was a question they really hadn't thought of, because they were we must have renewal rate of 80+%, and that will give us this financial return. Then we got into the second question, which is, okay, if we know that they're not all created equal, what do we know about these people? And we had very little customer insight. And so it's this indifference that we're somewhat creating, because we're focused on renewal rates and we must have a certain outcome by a certain date, and that will give us the numbers we need. But there was no mention of, so what does the customer tell us doing? And as soon as we did that, it changed the entire conversation. And I think that's the antidote to some of this petrol throwing, is that sometimes we just have to slow down and ask better questions of ourselves as we run these businesses, right?
And I had a quarterly planning 2 weeks ago, and on this concept of better, the room was very excited with the business owner there and his leadership team. And it was that excitement about, well, maybe bigger, right? That maybe more deals. But then we went into, well, what are we not willing to sacrifice? And I brought that idea and I put that bell curve, probably not exactly as you put it, Brady, in your book, but the idea of what are the things in our business that we are not willing to sacrifice? And of course, we don't want our teams to drift towards toxicity, they say. We want to protect our customers, current customers. We want to protect what we do. And we want to make sure that we do, and it's better than anybody else, what we do here. And eventually we set the limits. So how much can we actually afford perhaps to grow? Because with better, there's some growth happening. And what would be the non-acceptable below this line, right? This just not acceptable. And this Goldilocks zone, as we call them, it just brought a refreshed sort of energy in the room. Everyone felt so much better, obviously using that word. And that's exactly what they said at the end. It's like, now we can see a healthy, better path to something that we really, really want, rather than more deals and more deals. So the full concept of better actually brought a much refreshed energy into the room, not only for the business owner, but his full leadership team as well.
I think that you touch on an important point, that this is a book about mindset. This is about understanding who I am, because I am in an owner-led company as a leader. This propensity will lead me down this path, but the mindset, understanding I can do everything, but I can do anything, but I can't do everything, bringing it all back and saying this, yes, I must work on the business rather than in the business to build a better business that really is the kind of business that I want to work in. It makes me think about Zappos. So Zappos is an online shoe retailer in the US, and the founder, Tony Hsieh, had a business in Silicon Valley that he sold. I'm going to say, I think it was like 100 million, and I could well be wrong there, but it was a lot of money that he sold this business for, sold it to Microsoft and said, I don't want a bigger business. I want a better business. And so he went off and wanted to live in Las Vegas because of the climate or whatever it was and the lifestyle. And so he went out, started up this online shoe retailer in Las Vegas and said, I just want to have a place where people can work that I want to go to work with and enjoy. I want to do good things with our customers and for our customers. And I want to create a good financial environment. And he ended up selling that business for $1 billion to Amazon, but on the condition that he got to run it how he wants. It is about the mindset of compounding, and it's the mindset of understanding the things that I'm doing are not necessarily my fault. I'm not a bad person. This is the situation that I'm in, and there's something that I can do about it to build a better business and a better life.
And I think if we could build on that theme, the listeners could be left with a little bit of impression that we're sort of anti-big, anti-growth. I don't think we're saying that. I think what we're saying is that there needs to be a level of preparation, right? You write in the book around this idea that businesses growing in rapid rate, doubling in size, things like the leadership system, the cultural system, the people systems are in danger of breaking, right? Because there's the dislocation as it goes along. But let's say we are trying to grow a better business. What's the preparation? What is it that we can sort of offer as the antidote or the way to resist putting more petrol on the fire?
Well, I think that building a better team, building better customers, building better offerings, and building better financials is the antidote. But what it really does is it begs the question, what's the job to be done, using the jobs to be done framework mindset, right? And it says that there is a job for the owner in an owner-led business to have a new jobs. In one respect, you need to compound, and this is a book about compounding. You need to compound high-performing teams with soul to offset that drift. You need to compound loyal relationships with customers who refer others. You need to compound offerings that you are the best at, not mediocre at. You need to compound disciplined cash-on-cash returns. And you need to curate your better life by design. And that really frames out the job to be done that we talk about in the rest of the book.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important part, is that we've been talking very specifically about dimensions of business, but this whole book is about then reuniting that with the life that you want, the life that this business allows you to design for yourself, for your family, for your network of friends. That is the broader context of the job to be done.
Well, yeah, there is one you, and if you are an owner-led business owner, you can't pretend there's a different you that runs the business that is the rest of your life. It's all you. And that's really why those things are connected. You've got to build a better business that will enable you to build or design a better life.
Indeed.
I'm sure that our listeners are probably someone starting to rethink their goals after hearing this podcast. What would be the question, Brad, perhaps that you would like them to reflect on until next week's episode?
Well, how is the pressure for bigger affecting you through those areas of your DNA, your psychology, your society? And how is drift perhaps affecting your business? And is this, you only get one life. Are you building the life that you want? And are you walking down the right path? So that's probably what I'd say. And on that, what I would say is let's move to close. Any closing reflections, Richard?
I think I just need to make sure I know where the jerry cans are in every conversation.
The jerry cans that contain the petrol, obviously.
Exactly.
Any closing reflections, Andreas?
For me, it's the understanding of where that motivation is coming from, what might impact that I'm sure our listeners are probably getting that level of clarity as well. So they don't feel like I'm a bad person. It's just how we're driven. This is great. Clarity leads to better decisions.
Great. Let's wrap it up. I guess in reflection, able to now buy the book. If you go to Amazon, you can pre-order the book coming out on October 8th, 2025. Depends on when you're listening to this, of course, but the book is now available for pre-order. So I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation. Next week, we'll be digging into Better Team, the first of the 4 chapters about the business. What does it mean to have a better team? So I hope you can join us next week, and I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. Have a great week. Well, I hope that you enjoyed the episode. Please be sure to like and to subscribe for future episodes. And of course, this is part of the 7-part series releasing my new book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better. Be sure to join in next week for the next episode.